My name is Triss, and I learned the truth in the middle of the night, when the world was quiet enough that lies could no longer hide. It was 2:17 a.m. when my phone lit up beside my bed. I wasn't expecting anything. No calls, no messages, no emergencies. Just another night that was supposed to pass like all the others. I almost ignored it. I almost turned over and let the screen go dark. If I had, my life would still be built on a lie. The message had no name attached to it, no greeting, just a sentence that felt heavier the longer I stared at it. The will was changed. You were never meant to know. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. The words didn't make sense. My grandfather had been gone for months. His will had already been read. Everything had already been decided, or at least that was what I had been told. I sat up slowly. The room cold around me, my heart beginning to beat harder than it should. Outside my window, the street was empty. No cars, no voices, just the low sound of wind moving through the dark. The kind of silence that makes even a small sound feel loud. I typed back, my fingers unsteady. Who is this? The reply didn't come right away. The 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then appeared again. I held my breath without realizing. Finally, another message arrived. Someone who read the original document. My stomach tightened. There wasn't supposed to be an original document anymore. There was only the version my family had shown me, the version where my name never appeared. Another message followed. It was updated hours before he died. I felt a chill move through my chest, slow and sharp. I remembered the night my grandfather passed, the rushed calls, the sudden activity. The way everything felt hurried, like people were afraid time might run out. I stood up and walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the glass. My reflection stared back at me. Pale and unsure, I looked like someone who had believed the wrong people for too long. What did it say? I typed out this time. The response came quickly. It named you. Just 2 words, but they carried the weight of everything I had been denied. Named me how? I wanted to ask. As an afterthought, as a footnote, as a mistake. I didn't have to. Primary beneficiary. The room felt smaller. The walls closer. The air thicker. My chest tightened as if my body was trying to protect my heart from what my mind had already understood. Primary beneficiary meant everything. It meant my family lied to my face. It meant the silence after the funeral wasn't grief. It meant the way they avoided my eyes wasn't sadness. It was guilt. I sank back onto the bed, my phone heavy in my hand. My grandfather's face filled my mind, the way he used to watch people. Instead of talking, the way he asked questions that felt too deep for casual conversation. The way he once told me that patience revealed more than anger ever could. I remember the last time I saw him alive. He was weak, barely able to lift his hand. The room had been full of people pretending not to listen. He squeezed my fingers once and whispered, "Be patient." I didn't understand then. I did now. I typed again. Why wasn't I told? The response took longer this time. Because someone made sure you wouldn't be. My hands began to shake, not with fear, with clarity. Everything that never made sense suddenly did. The rushed reading of the will, the lawyer who avoided questions, the way my aunt spoke for everyone, the way my uncle insisted there was nothing to discuss. They hadn't just accepted the will, they had edited it. The final message came through. If you want proof, meet me tomorrow. Come alone. I stared at the screen long after it went dark. Tomorrow. In my family, tomorrow was always when things were buried, covered, forgotten. But this time, tomorrow was when everything would come into the light. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the quiet, watching the clock move forward, knowing that somewhere the people who erased me were still sleeping peacefully, unaware that their secret had slipped through the night and landed in my hands. By morning, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. I spent the rest of that night replaying memories I had never questioned before. Moments that once felt ordinary now felt staged, like scenes in a play where I had been standing on the wrong side of the curtain. Every word my family had spoken after my grandfather's death began to sound different in my head. Not softer, not kinder, but sharper, measured, careful. When the sun finally rose, it didn't feel like a new day. It felt like the continuation of a long lie that had finally started to crack. I stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. My phone lay on the table, silent now, but heavier than it had ever been. I kept looking at it, half expecting another message, half afraid of one, but nothing came. Whoever had contacted me had said enough. The rest was waiting. As I got ready that morning, I watched myself in the mirror more closely than usual. Not my face, but my eyes. They looked different, not angry, not scared, just awake. As if something inside me had finally stood up after years of sitting quietly. On my way out, I passed the photo frame on the shelf, a family picture from years ago, my grandfather in the center, everyone else gathered around him. I noticed something I had never noticed before. His hand rested lightly on my shoulder, not gripping, not claiming, just present, steady. I understood then that he had trusted me not because I demanded anything, but because I never did. The meeting place was across town, in an area my family never went. A quiet office building tucked between older shops. The kind of place that existed without drawing attention to itself, neutral, invisible, perfect for truths that weren't meant to be loud. I arrived early. I always did. Waiting had become second nature to me over the years, waiting to be heard, waiting to be noticed, waiting for conversations to include me instead of happening around me. The office door was closed. I sat on a bench across the hallway and watched people pass. None of them knew why my heart felt heavy. None of them knew that a version of my life was about to end. When the door finally opened, the man who stepped out looked nothing like the people in my family. He wasn't polished. He wasn't confident. He didn't smile easily. He looked like someone who had been carrying something he didn't want to hold anymore. He introduced himself quietly and motioned for me to come in. The room was small, 2 chairs, a table, no decorations, no warmth, just space. He didn't sit right away. He closed the door first, slowly, carefully, as if he wanted to be sure no sound escaped. I shouldn't be doing this, he said, finally sitting down. But what they did didn't sit right with me. I didn't rush him. Silence has a way of encouraging honesty when words feel heavy. He placed a thick folder on the table between us. I didn't touch it at first. I just looked at it. The weight of it felt real even without my hands on it. This was logged properly, he said. The update, signed, witnessed, filed. My throat felt dry. Then how did it disappear? I asked. He exhaled slowly, as if he had been waiting for that question. Because someone came back, he said. Someone who had access. Someone who knew exactly what to look for. I felt something tighten inside my chest. Not surprise. Confirmation. He opened the folder. Inside were documents that looked ordinary to anyone else. Dates, signatures, legal, language. But to me, they were everything I had been denied. I saw my grandfather's signature, shaky but clear. I saw the date, the time, and then I saw my name, not buried, not hidden, not added as an afterthought. It stood there with intention. Primary beneficiary. I felt my breath leave me slowly, like my body was afraid that if I inhaled too quickly, this might disappear. He was very clear. The man said, he asked that the update be handled quietly. He didn't trust the noise around him anymore. The noise, that word echoed in my head. My family had always been loud. Opinions, arguments, advice no one asked for. They filled rooms easily. They filled silence before it had a chance to speak. My grandfather never did. He knew. I said quietly. The man nodded. He suspected interference, he said. That's why he waited. That's why he insisted on a late update. Double quotes late. In the middle of the night. The same time the truth found me, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not happiness. Something steadier, something heavier. He trusted me, I said. Yes, the man replied. Enough to know you wouldn't rush. That hurt more than anything else. because it meant my grandfather had known exactly what kind of people surrounded him. And he had planned anyway. I closed the folder gently. "What happens now?" I asked. The man hesitated. "That depends on you," he said. "Legally, this changes everything. But emotionally, he stopped himself. Families don't take this well." I almost laughed. They had already decided I didn't belong. What more could they take? I left the office with copies of everything. The truth felt heavy in my bag, but lighter in my chest. Outside, the day continued as if nothing had changed. Cars passed, people talked. Life moved forward, but I knew something important. I couldn't confront them yet, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand how deep the betrayal went. That evening, I went to dinner at my aunt's house like nothing had happened. The same table, the same voices, the same stories told too loudly. They talked about money openly now, about plans, about renovations, about what they deserved. They spoke as if my grandfather had left them a gift, not a responsibility. I watched them carefully. My aunt avoided looking at me when she spoke about the estate. My uncle spoke faster than usual, like he was afraid of silence. My cousin checked his phone often, restless, distracted. They didn't know. And that made them careless. I smiled when expected. I nodded when spoken to. I listened more than ever, because revenge doesn't begin with confrontation. It begins with observation. That night, back in my room, I laid the documents out on the bed. I read them slowly, again and again. Not because I doubted them, but because I needed to understand the full shape of the truth. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. They had decided my place without my consent. They had edited my life quietly, confidently, assuming I would never question it. They were wrong. I didn't feel angry yet. Anger would come later. What I felt now was focus, the kind that doesn't shake. The kind that waits. And somewhere in the house, just a few rooms away, the people who erased me slept peacefully, unaware that the silence they relied on had finally chosen a different side. For days after that dinner, I said nothing. Not because I didn't have the words, but because words too early can ruin everything. I had learned that from watching my family my entire life. They talked first and thought later. They revealed themselves in the noise they created. I decided to let them keep talking. I returned to my routine as if nothing had changed. Work, errands, family visits. I answered messages with the same calm tone I always used. I laughed when something was supposed to be funny. I stayed quiet when conversations drifted toward money and plans. And I noticed how often my name was absent from them. It was as if I didn't exist at all. And that was exactly how they wanted it. The more I observed, the clearer everything became. My aunt had taken control of everything that once belonged to my grandfather. Not just the house or the accounts, but the story. She spoke as if she had been chosen. As if the position had always been hers. She corrected people when they spoke about him. She spoke for him, not with him. My uncle was different. He hovered on the edges of conversations, agreeing too quickly, nodding too often. He never contradicted my aunt, but he never led either. He was a man who followed decisions as long as they benefited him, and pretended loyalty when it was convenient. My cousin was the most careless of all. He acted like the future was already secured, like nothing could touch him. He spoke openly about plans that reached years ahead, as if the foundation under his feet was unbreakable. I listened. I remembered. And every night, I wrote everything down, times, words, reactions. Not because I needed proof yet, but because memory has a way of becoming selective when emotions rise. I wanted facts, clean, clear, undeniable. One evening, my aunt called me into the living room. She was sitting in my grandfather's chair, the one no one else ever used when he was alive. "Tris," she said gently, "you've been very quiet lately." I smiled. "Just tired," I replied. She studied my face, searching for something. Fear, maybe. Curiosity. Doubt. She found none. "You." "No," she continued. "These kinds of things can be confusing. Estates, paperwork. It's best when one person handles it. I nodded slowly. That makes sense, I said. Her shoulders relaxed just a little. We're doing what's best for everyone, she added, as if she needed to hear herself say it. Everyone. I wondered if she even realized how often she used that word without including me. That night, I contacted a lawyer. Not one connected to my family, not one recommended by anyone who had ever known them. I chose someone quiet, careful, experienced, the kind of person who listens more than they speak. I didn't tell him everything at once. I let him read the documents first. I watched his expression change as he reached my name. This is valid, he said finally. I know, I replied. He looked at me with something close to respect. This wasn't an oversight, he said. This was deliberate. I nodded. What would you like to do? He asked. I thought about my grandfather's voice, about patience, about timing. Nothing yet, I said. I want to understand how far this goes. He didn't argue. Then we observe, he said. So we did. Over the next weeks, we uncovered more than I expected. Accounts moved quietly, assets transferred quickly, decisions made without transparency. Everything was legal on the surface, but rushed underneath, like people afraid the ground might shift if they stayed still too long. They were right to be afraid. One afternoon, I overheard my cousin on the phone, laughing. She doesn't know anything, he said. She never does. I stood in the hallway, out of sight, my heart steady. He wasn't wrong. I didn't know anything before, but now I knew everything that mattered. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, it was realizing how comfortable they were with it. They didn't hesitate. They didn't struggle. They didn't doubt. They removed me as easily as one removes a name from a list. I wondered how long they had been planning it, whether it started when my grandfather fell ill, or long before that, whether they ever considered telling me the truth, or whether silence had always been the plan. One evening, my aunt invited me to sit with her again. This time, her tone was different, softer, almost rehearsed. You know, she said, your grandfather loved you. Just in a different way. I looked at her. What way was that? I asked calmly. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for me. He wanted you to be independent, she said. He didn't want money to complicate your life. I nodded slowly. It was a good story, almost convincing, but it didn't explain the signed update. It didn't explain the erased document. It didn't explain the late-night intervention. You must trust us, she added. Trust. The word landed heavy between us. I do, I said. And in that moment, I realized something important. They believed me. They believed I was still the same quiet person who accepted what was handed to her. They believed I would never question authority. They believed silence meant agreement. They were wrong. That night, I sat alone and thought about confrontation. About the moment when everything would be laid out on the table. About faces shifting from confidence to panic. About voices breaking under the weight of truth. But not yet. The truth doesn't rush. It waits until there is nowhere left to hide. And when it finally arrives, it doesn't ask for permission. By the time I reached this point, silence was no longer something that happened around me. It was something I was actively creating. I chose my words carefully. I chose my reactions even more carefully. Every look, every pause, every moment where I could have spoken but didn't became part of a larger shape I was building without anyone else realizing it. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. I still sat at the same table. I still drank the same tea. I still listened to the same stories about my grandfather as if they hadn't been rewritten 100 times already. But inside me, every version of the past was being rearranged. I was no longer the quiet observer. I was the only one in the room who knew the ending. My aunt began calling more often, not to ask how I was, but to update me, or rather, to inform me. She spoke as if she were doing me a favor by including me at all. Her voice carried a softness that felt practiced, like something she had rehearsed in front of a mirror. We've Been so busy, she would say. There's so much responsibility now. Responsibility. That word again. Always spoken like a crown, never like a weight. I responded with patience, with understanding, with the kind of calm that reassures people who are hiding something. I let her believe she was in control, because people who feel secure make mistakes. They stopped checking over their shoulders. My uncle, on the other hand, started watching me more closely, not openly, just small things. A pause when I entered a room, a glance that lingered a moment too long. He asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. How are you holding up? Still adjusting. Must be strange. All of this change. I answered honestly, but selectively. Yes, it is. I'm managing. I suppose we all are. He never pressed further. He didn't want answers. He wanted reassurance. My cousin remained careless. He joked loudly about the future, about trips he planned to take, about things he wanted to buy once everything was fully settled. He spoke as if the story had already been written in ink. Sometimes I wondered if he would have behaved differently if he knew how fragile that ink really was. At night, when the house was quiet, I reviewed everything with my lawyer. We spoke in low voices, even when we were alone. Not because we were afraid of being overheard, but because the truth felt heavier when spoken softly. He showed me timelines, transactions, decisions that had been rushed through before anyone could ask questions. The more we looked, the clearer it became that my family hadn't just acted out of greed. They had acted out of fear. Fear that my grandfather's final choice would undo everything they believed they were entitled to. Fear that I would ask questions. Fear that patience, the very thing they underestimated, would expose them. I started to see patterns in their behavior that I had never noticed before. My aunt controlled conversations by speaking first and speaking longest. She filled silence quickly, afraid of what might emerge if it lingered too long. My uncle avoided responsibility by agreeing with whoever spoke last. My cousin relied on confidence, believing it would carry him through anything. And me, I relied on time. One afternoon, I found myself alone in my grandfather's study. It hadn't changed since his death. The same books, the same chair, the same faint smell of paper and wood. I closed the door behind me and sat down, letting the quiet settle. I imagined him there, watching, not judging, just waiting. I wondered if he knew how this would unfold, if he had expected conflict, or if he believed the truth would eventually find its way out without resistance. I wondered if he had been disappointed in them, or simply resigned. I realized something then that surprised me. He hadn't trusted me with the truth because he expected me to fight. He trusted me because he knew I would endure. That realization stayed with me. The next phase of my plan wasn't about exposure. It was about pressure. Slow, invisible pressure that made people uneasy without knowing why. I asked small questions at the right moments. I mentioned details I shouldn't have known. I let my aunt catch glimpses of documents on my phone without explaining them. Not enough to accuse, just enough to disturb. I watched her confidence waver. Just slightly, a pause in her speech, a tightening of her smile, a moment where she asked, "Where did you hear that?" before quickly laughing it off. My uncle grew quieter. He stopped bringing things up in front of me. He avoided conversations altogether when he could. Guilt doesn't always scream. Sometimes it hides behind compliance. My cousin became defensive. He laughed louder, joked harder, but his eyes didn't match his tone anymore. He was beginning to sense that something was wrong, even if he couldn't name it. One evening, during dinner, my aunt said something that changed the air in the room. "We should finalize everything soon," she said. "Loose ends make me uncomfortable." Loose ends. I looked at her and smiled. "Me too," I said. She held my gaze for a second longer than necessary. That was the first time I saw real fear. Not panic, not anger. Uncertainty. After that night, she started calling the lawyer who had handled the original will more frequently. I knew because my lawyer knew. Questions were asked. Records were requested. But the answers didn't change. The truth doesn't bend just because someone wants it to. I could feel the tension building. like a storm that hadn't yet broken. Every conversation felt heavier. Every interaction more deliberate. They were starting to sense that control was slipping, even if they didn't know how or why. And still, I waited. Because the most powerful moment isn't when you reveal the truth. It's when the other side realizes they can no longer stop it. Asterisk the first crack didn't come with shouting or accusations. It came with a mistake. My aunt made it. She always believed she was the smartest person in the room. That belief had protected her for years. It made her confident. It also made her careless. One afternoon, she mentioned a document that I knew had never been shared with me. She spoke casually, as if it were nothing. Just a line in the middle of a longer sentence. She didn't even notice it at first. She only noticed when I stopped responding. What document? I asked, my voice calm. She froze for half a second. Just half, but it was enough. The one from the firm, she said quickly. The early draft. There it was. A word that shouldn't exist if the story they told me had been true. I tilted my head slightly, like I was confused. I didn't know there was an early draft, I said. Her smile tightened. Oh, you know how these things are. Paperwork changes. Nothing important. Nothing important. I nodded and let it go, but she didn't. From that moment on, she watched me constantly, not openly, not directly, but in reflections, in pauses, in the way her voice shifted when I entered a room. She knew she had slipped. She just didn't know how badly. That night, she confronted my uncle. I didn't hear the words, but I heard the tension. The muffled voices, the sharp silence that followed. Guilt sounds different when it's shared. The next day, my uncle came to me alone. Tris, he said, clearing his throat. Have you been speaking to anyone outside the family? I looked at him. About what? I asked. He hesitated. His eyes moved, searching for the safest answer. About your grandfather. He said finally. I thought of the man in the quiet office, the documents, the signatures. The truth that no longer belonged to just one person. I've spoken to people. I said truthfully. His face changed. Not anger, fear. You don't need to dig into the past, he said. It won't help anyone. Help, that word again. Always used to protect the people who caused the damage. I just want to understand, I said. He nodded too quickly. Of course, he said, of course. But he didn't believe me, because deep down, he already understood. That evening, my cousin lost his temper for the first time. It wasn't directed at me, not openly. It spilled out sideways, a slammed door, a raised voice. Complaints about stress, about pressure, about things not moving fast enough. They're dragging this out, he said loudly. Everything was supposed to be done by now. Everything. I sat quietly in the next room, listening. I realized something then that made my chest tighten. They weren't just afraid of exposure. They were afraid of time. Because the longer this went on, the closer the truth moved to the surface. A week later, I decided it was time. Not for a full reveal, just enough to force them into the open. I asked for a meeting, neutral place, neutral room. They agreed to quickly. People who think they're still in control often do. We sat across from each other at a long table, my aunt at the head, out of habit, my uncle beside her. My cousin leaning back, arms crossed, pretending. He didn't care. I placed a folder on the table, not the full one, just enough. I had some questions. I said calmly. My aunt smiled tightly. Of course, I opened the folder and slid a single page forward. The signature was visible. The date was clear. My name sat quietly at the bottom. No explanation. No accusation. Just truth. The room went still. My cousin leaned forward, suddenly alert. My uncle's face drained of color. My aunt didn't move at all. She stared at the paper for a long time before speaking. Where did you get this? She asked. I met her gaze. You already know, I said. Her smile disappeared. This doesn't mean what you think it means, she said quickly. There were drafts, discussions, nothing final. I let the silence stretch. Then why remove it? I asked. No one answered. Because lies collapse when questions become too simple. My cousin stood up. This is ridiculous, he said. You're overthinking things. I looked at him. Am I asked. He stopped talking. My uncle rubbed his hands together nervously. After that meeting, nothing felt stable anymore. Not the house, not the conversations, not even the silence. Everything carried weight now. Every sound felt louder, every pause heavier, as if the walls themselves knew what had been said and were waiting for the rest to unfold. The call started the next morning. Lawyers first. Careful voices. Polite words. Questions framed like suggestions. They didn't accuse me directly, but they didn't need to. The documents spoke louder than any voice ever could. Dates, signatures, records that refused to bend no matter how many times someone tried to explain them away. Then came the family calls. My uncle called twice and hung up both times before I answered. On the third attempt, I picked up. We need to talk, he said immediately. We already did, I replied. This is getting serious, he added, as if it hadn't always been. It was serious the night the document disappeared, I said calmly. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just sighed, a sound heavy with regret that came far too late. My cousin didn't call at all. He sent messages instead, short, sharp, defensive. You're blowing this out of proportion. This will hurt everyone. You don't know what you're doing. I read them without responding. Because for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I was doing. My aunt waited the longest. When she finally called, her voice was different, lower, slower, stripped of the confidence she wore so easily before. We never meant to hurt you, she said. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Then why hide it? I asked. Silence filled the line. We were afraid, she admitted finally, afraid not of losing me, of losing control. That was the truth she couldn't avoid anymore. As the days passed, the legal process moved forward with a steady pace that no one could stop. Assets were reviewed, timelines reconstructed, decisions questioned. The more the lawyers uncovered, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was intervention, quiet, deliberate, calculated. My family tried to hold things together publicly. Smiles were forced, appearances maintained. But behind closed doors, everything was unraveling. Conversations turned sharp. Accusations replaced reassurances. Trust collapsed under the weight of exposure. I heard fragments of arguments through walls. My aunt blaming my uncle for being careless. My uncle blaming my cousin for speaking too freely. My cousin blaming everyone else for not protecting him. No one blamed themselves. And that told me everything I needed to know. One evening, my aunt knocked on my door. I hadn't expected that. She stood there without her usual confidence. No practiced smile. No careful posture. Just a woman who had finally run out of control. Can we talk? She asked. I stepped aside and let her in. She looked around my room like she was seeing it for the first time, as if she had just realized I was more than a quiet presence in the background. I didn't think it would come to this, she said softly. It always does, I replied. She sat down slowly. We built our lives around certain expectations, she said. We believed we were protecting the family. I looked at her. You protected yourselves, I said. There's a difference. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. We didn't think you would fight, she admitted. I nodded. That was your mistake, I said. Not because I'm strong, but because you assumed silence meant weakness. She had no answer for that. When she left, I felt lighter. Not victorious, just free. The legal decisions came one by one. Accounts frozen. Transfers reversed. Authority questioned. The house, once a symbol of unity, became a reminder of division. The place where my grandfather had tried to keep peace now stood quiet and tense, filled with people who no longer trusted one another. My cousin finally confronted me in person. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He looked tired. You really went through with it, he said. Yes, I replied. He nodded slowly. I thought you wouldn't, he admitted. I know, I said. He exhaled and looked away. That's on us, he muttered. It was the closest thing to accountability I would ever hear. As weeks turned into months, the noise faded. The panic settled into acceptance. Not forgiveness, not understanding, just reality. I stood on the outside of it all, no longer begging to be included, no longer questioning my place. The truth had done its work. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. And as everything my family built on lies collapsed quietly under its own weight, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt finished. By the time everything was decided, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a museum of unfinished conversations. Every room carried echoes of voices that used to fill it, now replaced by a quiet that felt permanent. Not peaceful, just settled. Like dust after something collapses. The final decision arrived on an ordinary morning. No dramatic call. No raised voices. No celebration. Just a message from my lawyer, calm and factual, explaining that the last pieces had fallen into place. The will update was recognized. The interference was documented. What my grandfather had chosen in his final hours was now honored the way it should have been from the beginning. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it. I expected relief. I expected satisfaction. I expected something that felt like victory. Instead, I felt still. The kind of stillness that comes after a long storm, when your body hasn't yet realized it no longer needs to brace itself. The money didn't excite me. The property didn't either. What mattered had already happened. The truth had been acknowledged. The lie had been corrected. My place, which had never truly been lost, had finally been returned. My family didn't gather after that. There was no meeting, no apology, no final conversation where everything was explained and forgiven. Life doesn't work that way. People rarely sit in a circle and admit who they were when they thought no one was watching. They drifted instead. My aunt moved out first, quietly, without saying goodbye. She took only what she could justify and left behind the rest, as if distance might soften what had happened. My uncle followed not long after. He tried once to speak to me, standing awkwardly in the doorway, hands folded like he was waiting for instructions. I hope one day you'll understand, he said. I already do, I replied. That was the end of it. My cousin left last. He packed quickly, angrily, as if speed could erase responsibility. Before he drove away, he stopped and looked back at the house. You didn't have to go this far, he said. Yes, I answered. I did. He didn't respond. He just nodded once and got into his car. When they were gone, the house felt different. Not empty, honest, for the first time since my grandfather passed. It felt like the truth was allowed to exist within those walls. I walked through each room slowly. I touched the door frames, the shelves, the desk where my grandfather used to sit late at night, reading quietly while everyone else slept. I imagined him there, patient as always, knowing that time would finish what he started. I understood then that he hadn't been trying to punish anyone. He had been trying to protect something simple, fairness. The weeks that followed were quiet. Not the tense quiet I had grown used to, but a softer one. A quiet that allowed thoughts to settle instead of crowding each other. I went through his things carefully, letters, notes, books with pages folded at corners. In one drawer, I found a small envelope with my name written on it in his handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper. No legal language. No instructions. Just one sentence. Truth doesn't need permission. I held that paper for a long time. That sentence explained everything. Why he waited. Why he trusted silence. Why he believed patience would outlast manipulation. I realized then that the inheritance was never the point. The point was choice. He chose me not because I was quiet, but because I listened. Not because I demanded, but because I endured. He chose me because he knew I wouldn't rush to anger or destroy everything in front of me just to prove I was right. And I hadn't. I had waited. I had watched. I had let the truth speak for itself. That was the real justice. As time passed, people stopped whispering. The story faded into something less dramatic, less sharp. Just another family disagreement, softened by distance and time. That was fine with me. I didn't need my story to be loud to know it mattered. What mattered was what I learned. That silence is not absence. That patience is not weakness. That being underestimated is often the greatest advantage you will ever have. I didn't lose my family that year. I lost the illusion of them. And in return, I gained something far more valuable, clarity. Now, when I think back to that night, to the moment my phone lit up in the darkness, I don't feel fear anymore. I feel gratitude. Gratitude that the truth found its way to me before it was too late. Gratitude that I listened instead of looking away. Because some messages don't arrive to disturb your sleep. They arrive to wake you up. And once you are awake, truly awake, you never belong to silence again.